We've all made mistakes. But some habits? They quietly keep us from ever getting wiser. Here are 7 signs of foolishness and how to rise above them. If you're on the path to self-mastery, subscribe and join the journey. Sign number 1. The need to always be right. There's a quiet kind of foolishness that doesn't shout, it insists. It shows up in debates that never end, in conversations that feel like battlegrounds, and in the exhausting need to always have the final word. It's not about truth, it's about control. And it's one of the clearest signs of a person trapped by their own ego. I once knew a man named Darren, brilliant in his field, respected by many. But Darren had a flaw: he couldn't lose an argument, ever. If someone disagreed with him, he didn't just defend his point, he went to war for it. He'd dig up obscure statistics, quote half-remembered books, and spin the conversation so tightly that most people just gave up. Not because he was right, but because he was relentless. At first, I admired his confidence, but over time, I noticed something else. People stopped engaging with him. His team grew distant, his family quiet. He won every argument, but slowly, he lost every connection. And Darren couldn't see it. To him, being right was a form of love, a way of proving he cared, that he was invested. But to those around him, it felt like being bulldozed. Their voices didn't matter. Their ideas were always almost right. Their concerns were footnotes in his monologue. The Stoics warned us about this kind of pride. Epictetus once said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." That's the trap. When you're obsessed with being right, you stop listening. You stop growing. You mistake dominance for wisdom. And slowly, you become someone who's always talking but never truly heard. Here's what intelligent people understand: that being right is not the same as being wise. Wisdom is humble. It knows the difference between truth and opinion. It knows when to speak and when to silence, do the talking. So how do you know if you're stuck in the need to be right? Do you find yourself interrupting even when the other person hasn't finished? Do you feel uneasy when someone challenges your perspective? Do you win arguments but feel emptier after they're done? If so, it's time to ask a harder question. Am I trying to connect or just to conquer? Because the truth is, no one ever grew wiser by proving someone else wrong. We grow by letting go of the need to always be right, and instead choosing to understand. Darren eventually learned this the hard way. After a strained conversation with his teenage daughter, she finally said, "Dad, I don't need you to be right. I need you to hear me." That one sentence cracked his armor. From that day, Darren began to change. He started listening more, speaking less, and slowly, the people in his life returned, not because he was still brilliant, but because he had become gentle. That's what wise people do. They choose connection over control, curiosity over ego, growth over victory. Because in the end, it's not about being right all the time. It's about being someone worth listening to. Sign number 2, "I'll do it later," isn't a plan, it's a trap. There's a phrase so subtle, so socially acceptable, that we barely notice how it quietly kills momentum. "I'll do it later." It sounds harmless, responsible even, like we're being strategic with our time. But underneath that calm exterior lies one of the most dangerous self-sabotage patterns a person can adopt: the illusion that there will always be time. I once knew a man named Darren. He was sharp, creative, full of potential. For years, he talked about launching his own design business. He sketched logos on napkins, collected quotes about freedom, saved bookmarks for entrepreneurship videos. And every time someone encouraged him, his answer was the same: I will, just not yet. I'm getting things lined up. But lining things up never ended. First, it was after the promotion, then after the holidays, then after he felt more ready. One day, I ran into him 5 years later. Same job, same complaints, same quiet sadness behind his eyes. He looked at me and said, "You know, I think I waited too long, not for the opportunity, for my courage to show up." That moment haunted me, because later sounds like a plan, but it's often a trap dressed in patience, a way to delay discomfort, to avoid the fear of imperfection, to stay safe while life passes you by. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." Not to be morbid, but to sharpen clarity. You see, every time you say, "I'll start when I have more time," life quietly replies, "What if you don't?" Here's how you know this trap is catching you. You keep rewriting the same goal year after year, but never begin. You feel overwhelmed, not because the task is too big, but because your avoidance is feeding your anxiety. You spend more energy planning than acting. This isn't laziness, it's fear in disguise. But intelligent people, those who walk the Stoic path, understand that discipline lives in the now. They don't wait for perfect alignment. They start with what they have, imperfectly, consistently. Because action, even a small one, is the only antidote to regret. So the next time later shows up at your doorstep, don't welcome it with excuses. Ask instead, if not now, when? Take the first step, write the paragraph, make the call, say the apology. Not tomorrow, today. Because someday is not a day of the week. And potential unexpressed becomes pain. Now that we've unmasked the trap of delay, let's turn to another deceptive behavior, one that hides insecurity behind the mask of arrogance. You've seen it before. Maybe you've even done it yourself. Let's talk about the insecure braggart. Sign number 3, the insecure braggart. Some people speak loudly not to be heard, but to be seen. You've met them before. The ones who find a way to turn every conversation back to themselves, their accomplishments, their struggles, their greatness. But underneath that constant self-promotion, a quiet fear that if they stop talking, no one will see them. I once worked with a man named Felix. At first, he came across as impressive, always had a story, always had a lesson, always had a win to share. And don't get me wrong, success should be celebrated. But with Felix, it was different. No matter the topic, whether it was a casual lunch or a team meeting, the spotlight somehow always circled back to him. You'd mention a recent vacation, and he'd counter with his 5-star trip to Bali. You'd talk about a small win, and he'd top it with his game-changing idea. You'd share a quiet struggle, and he'd remind you how he overcame something even harder. At first, it felt like confidence, but over time, it became exhausting, and eventually, transparent. Because real confidence doesn't interrupt, it listens. Real strength doesn't flex, it holds space. And real wisdom knows this: your worth doesn't need constant narration. The Stoics understood this deeply. Waste no more time talking about what a good man should be. Be one. Marcus Aurelius. Felix wasn't trying to impress. He was trying to feel worthy. He confused admiration with acceptance. And in doing so, he missed the point entirely. The more he talked about himself, the more people tuned out. The more he proved his brilliance, the more disconnected he became. Because the moment someone needs to constantly remind you of their greatness, You have to wonder, who are they trying to convince? Let me be clear, sharing your story, your journey, your wisdom, that's valuable. But if your story becomes a spotlight that blinds others, rather than a torch that lights the way, then it's not wisdom. It's ego in a costume. So how do you recognize this tendency in others, or even in yourself? You dominate conversations and rarely ask questions. You feel a compulsion to one-up someone else's story. You struggle with silence because silence means you're not being praised. Here's what the wise do differently. They let others finish their thoughts. They ask before they answer. They share not to impress, but to connect. Because the man who knows his worth doesn't need to shout it. His actions speak. His presence speaks. His listening speaks. And here's the most powerful truth of all. The people we admire most, they rarely boast, because they know authenticity doesn't need applause. So if you catch yourself reaching for validation in every sentence, pause, breathe, ask yourself, am I trying to connect or trying to compete? Because a moment of quiet confidence speaks louder than a lifetime of forced greatness. Now, from the noise of self-promotion, we shift to a different kind of silence, one that doesn't crave attention, but avoids responsibility. Let's talk about the next sign, the one who blames and never builds. Sign number 4, the blame artist. Some people wear blame like armor, not to protect themselves, but to avoid ever looking inward. When things go wrong, they never pause, never reflect. Instead, their eyes scan the room, searching for someone else to point at. They don't ask, what can I learn? They ask, who can I blame? I once worked on a nonprofit project with a woman named Clarissa. She was brilliant on paper, resourceful, articulate, confident. But every time something slipped, a missed deadline, a miscommunication, a failed pitch, pattern was always the same. It was the marketing team's fault. It was the donor's fault. It was the intern's lack of preparation. Never once did she say, I could have done better. At first, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. But over time, it became clear. Clarissa wasn't leading, she was dodging. And with every excuse, she pushed her team further away. Eventually, even those who admired her began to disconnect, not because they hated her, but because they couldn't trust her. The Stoics warned us about this mindset. Seneca once wrote, "It is the power of a great mind to rise above insults, injuries, and the failure of others." And I would add, it is the power of a wise person to rise above the need to blame. Because here's the quiet truth. When you always blame, you never build. You never improve. You become excellent at analysis, but awful at accountability. Blame is seductive because it feels like action. It gives us something to say, someone to target, but it doesn't fix anything. And more importantly, it blinds us to the only power we truly have, our ability to respond, learn, and adapt. So how do you spot the blame artist or recognize one in yourself? When mistakes happen, the first instinct is to find fault, not find solutions. Feedback is seen as threat, not growth. "It wasn't my fault" becomes a personal mantra. But here's what intelligent, resilient people do instead. They pause before reacting. They ask, what was my part in this? Even if it's only 10%. They take responsibility not because they're guilty, but because they want to grow. Because blame is a dead end, but ownership is a doorway. And you'll notice something powerful once you cross that threshold. People start trusting you more. You stop defending and start leading. Your confidence is no longer performative, it's earned. Clarissa eventually left the organization, but not before losing the respect of a team that had once believed in her. And what broke that trust wasn't her mistakes. It was her refusal to own them. So ask yourself today, are you building trust or blaming your way through it? Because when blame becomes a habit, growth becomes impossible. But when ownership becomes a practice, everything changes. And speaking of growth, let's move next to the subtle poison that kills it quietly. Not arrogance, but the fear of change masked as comfort. Sign number 5, the comfort zone prisoner. Some people don't live, they merely repeat. They wake up each day, not to grow, but to maintain, to protect what they've always known, even if what they've known is holding them back. This is the hallmark of a foolish person. They confuse comfort with wisdom and safety with purpose. Take Richard, for example. He spent 30 years in the same job, not because he loved it, but because the idea of learning something new, being uncomfortable, starting from scratch terrified him. He once told me, "At least here, I know what to expect." But here's the problem with staying in one place too long. Eventually, the world moves without you. The industry changed. The tools changed. The clients changed. And Richard? He stayed the same until he was asked to step aside. The Stoics warned us about this kind of stagnation. They didn't view comfort as success, they viewed challenge as the true measure of growth. Seneca said, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." Avoiding change might feel smart in the short term, but it's often just fear disguised as logic. It's the inner whisper that says, "Don't risk, don't reach, just stay." But every day you stay in the same small circle, your world shrinks. Not because the world is shrinking, but because your courage is. So how do you break free? Start small. Try something that makes you nervous. Ask uncomfortable questions. What am I avoiding? What am I clinging to? Challenge the thought that says, "This is just who I am." Because who you are is shaped not by what you do once, but by what you keep doing or avoiding. Growth is never accidental. It demands discomfort, effort, and the willingness to look foolish for a while. So take a moment and look around your life. Are your routines still serving you or quietly sedating you? Because the comfort zone may feel familiar, but familiarity is not the same as fulfillment. And if you stay too long, you'll forget what growth even feels like. But there's another kind of stagnation, one that doesn't come from staying in place, but from never truly hearing anything new. Let's turn now to the habit that blocks wisdom before it even has a chance to speak. Sign number 6, the non-listener. There's a quiet arrogance that often goes unnoticed. Not loud or aggressive, but persistent. It's found in those who pretend to listen while actually waiting for their turn to speak. This is the non-listener, someone who talks more than they hear, and when they do hear, they don't really listen. I once met a man named Vincent. He was successful, charming, always had a story to tell. But every conversation with him felt one-sided. If you shared a struggle, he'd cut in with a bigger one. If you celebrated a win, he'd pivot back to his own life. And if you offered a different opinion, he'd politely dismiss it and steer the dialogue back to familiar ground. Over time, people stopped confiding in him, not because he was cruel, but because they felt unheard. Here's what the Stoics taught. True wisdom isn't shown by how well you speak, but by how deeply you listen. Epictetus said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." The non-listener doesn't just miss what others are saying. they miss opportunities to grow, connect, and understand. Because in their rush to be right, they abandon the chance to be changed. Think of it this way. When you only talk, you repeat what you know. But when you listen, you open yourself to what you don't know. And that's where transformation lives. So, how do you spot or confront this habit in yourself? Ask, am I responding to understand or just to reply? Pay attention to how often you interrupt or redirect the topic. Notice if people feel safe and heard around you or simply tolerated. Because listening isn't passive, it's powerful. It builds trust. It deepens insight. And it shows a kind of intelligence that doesn't seek attention but seeks truth. If you want to become someone others trust, respect, and remember, don't just sharpen your voice, sharpen your silence. Let others speak not so you can win the conversation, but so you can elevate it. And once you learn the art of truly listening, you'll be ready to confront another illusion of wisdom, the one that tells you kindness is a weakness. Up next, let's explore a trait that's often mistaken for strength, but actually reveals the absence of emotional maturity. Sign number 7, the cold-hearted. There's a kind of foolishness that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't insult, argue, or boast. Instead, it hides behind indifference, the kind that confuses detachment with strength. This is the cold-hearted, someone who sees empathy as weakness and compassion as a waste of time. I remember a man named Raymond. He was brilliant in many ways, analytical, efficient, a master of logic. But when it came to people, he was distant, detached, dismissive. If a colleague was struggling, he'd shrug and say, "That's life." If someone opened up emotionally, he'd change the subject or offer hollow advice. Toughen up, move on. Raymond wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply believed that feeling too much made you weak. But here's the paradox. What he called strength was actually fear in disguise. The Stoics never told us to suppress emotion, only to master it. They believed in compassion with discipline, not coldness as protection. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." And being good, being wise, requires one thing Raymond lacked: empathy. Without empathy, intelligence becomes sterile. Without warmth, wisdom becomes isolation. And without connection, even the sharpest minds fall into quiet irrelevance. Because here's the truth. You cannot lead, love, or grow if you cannot feel with others. Raymond eventually learned this the hard way. A close friend of his lost a parent. When the friend reached out, Raymond offered a brief robotic text. No call, no presence, just silence. Months later, when Raymond faced a crisis of his own, no one showed up. Not out of malice, but because he had never truly been there for anyone else. That's when it hit him. He hadn't built relationships. He had built walls. So how do you avoid becoming the cold-hearted? Recognize that empathy isn't surrender, it's strength with the soul. Listen not to fix, but to understand. Allow yourself to feel discomfort when others suffer, and respond with presence, not just platitudes. Because being stoic isn't about being numb. It's about being steady and soft, clear-eyed, yet kind, firm in boundaries, but warm in spirit. So if you've been guarding your heart so tightly that no one can reach it, ask yourself, is that strength or simply fear dressed in armor? Because wisdom without warmth is just distance. And intelligence without heart, it may impress, but it will never inspire. final reflections, and your 7-day challenge. The truth is, we all stumble. At some point, we've blamed instead of owned, spoken too much and listened too little, hidden behind later because now felt too hard. But that doesn't make us foolish. It just makes us unfinished. The Stoics never asked us to be perfect, only to be honest, present, and willing to grow. Because real intelligence isn't loud. It's quiet, disciplined, and deeply self-aware. It doesn't scream to prove itself. It reflects, it adapts, it evolves. So here's your 7-day reflection challenge. For the next 7 days, take 5 minutes each evening and ask, did I speak with intention today or just out of habit? Did I choose growth or choose the comfort of staying the same? Did I pause to listen to myself and others without judgment? Write down one insight each day. It doesn't have to be profound, just honest. At the end of the week, review what you wrote. You'll be surprised by the patterns you see and the power that comes from awareness. Because wisdom isn't a destination. It's a direction one you choose daily. So if this video gave you something to think about, something to pause and reflect on, tap like, share it with someone who values growth, and subscribe so we can keep walking this path together. And as always, stay humble, stay evolving, and above all, stay true to yourself. Thank you for watching. Until next time.